people often forget that the Zionist project is only 150 years old, right? It's a very new concept. And 75 years after their inception, they got their objective, the state of Israel. They delivered it. We're 76 years on from that moment, and we're no closer to liberating Palestine. So that says more about us than it says about them. I have spoken to some very senior people from the Muslim vote over the last few months. And I think, there will be a conversation we'll have in a few months about the lessons learned and how we mobilize, right? But the key challenge I have, though, with their approach is the Muslim thing, right? And I'll explain why. So,
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So alhamdulillah, another week of the SalaamSeeker podcast, and we have another guest, Brother Muhammad, come all the way from Leicester, alhamdulillah, to impart some wisdom into post-election and also Palestine and how the two intertwine, inshallah.
Jazakallah for having me.
But before we get into the crux of the conversations, please do like, subscribe, and share. It allows us to continue to work on the work that we do and just share.
And bring more guests.
Bring more guests in, exactly. Alhamdulillah. So, Brother Muhammad, why don't you just give a little introduction about yourself?
Inshallah. Yeah, sure. No, Jazakallah for having me. Really, really looking forward to this conversation. So, my name is Muhammad, and for the most part of my life, I lived a very normal life, busy with work. Got a good degree, worked in London, etc., etc. But then I think a lot of things changed after October last year, when we witnessed the sort of genocide unfolding in Gaza. And alhamdulillah, about 2 years ago, I was blessed with a baby boy.
MashaAllah.
And I've always seen these conflicts happen periodically. Every couple of years it flares up.
Especially Ramadan and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then it dies down. And I feel like this time it hit me differently because I'm a father now. And obviously you've seen the amount of children that have either lost limbs, been killed, buried under the rubble, lost their parents. And I think as a parent now, it makes you think about things slightly differently. So it made me think about, well, what can I do? And for many years, I attend the protests like everybody else. I boycott certain brands like everybody else. But I always felt like that was literally protest politics.
Yeah.
I felt like nothing ever changed with that. I mean, we've been protesting for decades now, and nothing's really changed. So I thought, how do I apply everything I've learned in the professional world into something that can do some social good?
Yeah.
So in terms of what I do, so I'm a strategy consultant. So I help big corporates really think about the future, think about what they need to succeed, and make sure that they dominate their industry. So I've worked for consulting firms like Deloitte, McKinsey, helped clients like David Lloyd, Barclays, Chanel, some really big companies.
Yeah.
And I just thought, why can't I apply that same logic to do some good?
Yeah.
So that's what got me thinking about doing something differently, and that's what eventually led me to create Palitics.
Yeah, that's what you mentioned, Palitics. What is Palitics? And give us a bit of insight into it.
So Palitics is a cross between Palestine and politics in terms of playing on the words.
Yeah.
And I remember towards the end of last year, there was this organization called the Muslim Vote that stood up, right? And I thought, great, I'll just join them, and it'll make perfect sense because I wanted to do something about the election that was coming up. But I just felt like with the Muslim Vote guys, it didn't sit right with me that we then packaged up Palestine as a Muslim-only issue, right? And I think if you've been to some of the protests, you see Jewish people there, Christian people there, atheists there, right?
Yeah, we've been to.
And I just felt like the media always say that Gaza is a Muslim-only issue,
and
we were kind of saying yes, it is, because the moment we mobilize for it, we make it a Muslim-only issue. So that for me didn't sit right with me. And I think the other thing that I thought was slightly different was that the Muslim Vote guys, I think they're doing a really good job nationally to try and create some level of organization and logistics. But I feel like they're doing what we've always done in the community, just with a new website.
Yeah.
Because what I want to challenge is the very premise of how local community politics is done. So in my community, I'm sure in many other communities, you have this kind of community elder that will say every 5 years, vote for this guy, and then everybody just vote. But there's no real challenge behind that. There's no real scrutiny. You don't quite understand why. And I think you have to really, if you want to open the minds of Muslims, especially young Muslims that are hoping to live here for the next 50, 60 years, really think critically about why you should vote in a certain way. Because if you just get told constantly to vote in a certain way, you'll never really open your mind and intellectually challenge why you need to vote for a certain person. And if you don't do that, you can't really promote good people to have good policies, right? So I thought there was just a huge sort of papering over the cracks and sort of some fundamentalism that needed to be addressed here. So that's what led me to create Palitics, where we look at data as a key driver into your decision making. So no longer should somebody tell you how to vote, you should challenge them and say, well, why should I vote this way? Right? Because if we don't do that, like I said, we won't hire good people to make good in the world. So Palitics is about giving you the data you need to understand that if you put in your postcode, here's my MP, here's their voting record on key Palestinian issues, here's what they've said, have they received any money from pro-Israeli groups, and it just gives you all that summary detail right in your fingertips.
So this is entirely related to Palestine and Palestine only?
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of the politics?
Yes, yeah.
So I just wanted to ask, what's the difference then between Palitics and the Muslim vote? Because the criteria you set out, I haven't been aware of Palitics until I contacted you, but it sounds pretty much exactly the same as the Muslim vote, as in, have they been funded, what's their previous history on terms of voting and stuff.
And I think you can also put postcode there.
Yeah, you literally put your postcode in. So what's the difference between the Muslim vote strategy and your strategy?
So I suppose there's a few differences, right? So I think the first difference I have is that I like to make data-driven insights. So I show you statistically who is best placed to beat Labour, for example, in your area. Whereas the Muslim vote will just say, back this Muslim independent, because that's the approach, right? Even if he has no chance of winning. And interestingly, I've been crunching some of the numbers since the election. So we've had 5 independents that won out of 650, right? Of which Jeremy Corbyn was one, so you can't really include him.
Anyway, he was going to win.
He was going to win, right?
There's one Leicester, right?
Yeah, Leicester South, my area, exactly.
Yeah.
But of the other areas, had the Independent, the Workers' Party and the Green Party work together and have one member, you'd have got 43 extra seats.
Really?
Yeah, that much. And if you add the Liberal Democrats to that equation, so you say the Lib Dems, the Greens, the Independent and the Workers' Party, you get 86.
Wow.
So you think about the Green Party have 4, Independents have 5, Reform have 5.
That's still nowhere near the 86, so all of them would have benefited.
Completely, right? You would have 5 Independents, 4 Greens, that's 9, and then you'd have 86 new ones that you'd have coalesced together. That's nearly 100 members.
But you know what the issue with that is, though? They all got different views.
This is the problem. But the issue I have is for this election alone, Gaza is the priority, right?
But were they all supporting Gaza?
Yeah, the Lib Dems, the Green Party, they all vote for a ceasefire. Now, the issue I have is that, and this is why we've kept it to Palestine only, because if you start layering on more issues like I don't know, even tax, right? There'll be some Muslims who say, I want to pay low tax, right? Because they're businessmen or whatever. And I just felt like the more issues you layer on, the more divided you get people. If you have one issue in mind, you'll just keep it really simple. And as a community, I think we should learn to walk before we run.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a fair point, but with the independent votes, I mean, that's quite interesting take, to be fair. We didn't look at it that way with those numbers that you've crunched. We're trusting you on those numbers.
I'll send you the data.
So alhamdulillah. I like the way that you're using data to drive conversation, because in the professional, because I'm kind of got a data background myself.
Okay.
So I exactly know the power of data and insights. But not everyone looks at it that way. So,
I agree.
And so how are you going to speak to someone? Because even
Humanize it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think you are trying with the Palestine situation, but it's beyond that as well, isn't it? Because if you're going if you're focusing on just MP and someone trying to get into MP, Palestine is a huge thing that's happening right now, and it's happening all the time. But there's so many other issues that you do kind of need to be competent in. So,
but what I would say to that is, right, so for me, I don't think of the liberation of Palestine as some weird, random foreign policy issue.
No, 100%. And I agree.
I see it intrinsically linked to the very fabric of our society.
You're right.
And what I mean by that
And
is...
our policies as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like the same people that are saying for a free Palestine, like Jeremy Corbyn, some very notable left-wing people, they're also advocating for, an overinvestment in the NHS, better education, better housing, better social provisioning. So for me, they're not interdependent. They're actually quite linked.
Yeah, they are.
And therefore, if you can promote good politicians to support the liberation of Palestine, I feel that has a trickling down effect into our wider society.
No, I think that's a fair comment.
But, so I noticed on your website that you pretty much encourage supporting Labour candidates. Right.
Some Labour candidates.
Some. Yes.
Okay. So my view, and I know this is where me and the Muslim vote differ again. So they did say vote for some Labour, and then they got a huge backlash.
And then they changed it to all independents.
To independents, right? But my view is this, right? That as Muslims that live in this country, we are usually very stigmatized and marginalized just because of our faith, right? You might be the best social worker in the city or in your area, but that's often overlooked because you're a Muslim. And people will make accusations about you because of your faith. And I feel like, how can we apply that same logic to good standing Labour MPs, right, who have done all the things they possibly can, like people like Zara Sultana, people like Diane Abbott, Dawn Butler. They voted for a ceasefire, they don't have any Israeli funding, they've been pro-Palestinian before you and I were even born.
Before we even knew about anything.
Right? And I feel like, even our Prophet, peace be upon him, in his final sermon in Arafat, He said that no Arab is better than a non-Arab,
Yeah.
other than through his deeds and actions.
Yeah.
And I feel like, how on earth can we then say that you don't get our vote because you're part of some associated Labour Party? I think that's just construed.
Yeah.
It's-
I wanted to ask something as well. Do you think in the future is it possible for you both to work? Because we've actually had guests from Muslim Vote and yourself, and I can hear you. The vision is, I would say, the same. Because obviously the liberation, even for these guys as well, the liberation for Palestine, I mean, that was the forefront. Because we had independence in Luton.
Yes.
As well. There were two of them.
We got one of them over as well in our podcast, Brother Atik.
And the first thing that for them as well that they put forward, because they know that is what we want, that's what the community wants, is Palestine. Even though, because just like you said yourself, people with those kind of views, NHS would be there. I mean, it makes sense because you care about.
And
people.
I agree.
You're not going to be like,
You're not going to suddenly be like, now I don't care about NHS.
You know what I'm interested about is I want to know, do you think there's a possible chance of yourself and Muslim Vote working together in some way, or is there a way to do that? Because for me, I love the fact you've got that skill and resources, and they've got some form of skills and resources. And if there's a way we could combine that, I mean,
100%.
that's amazing.
It's a really good question, and I have spoken to some very senior people from the Muslim Vote over the last few months, and I think there will be a conversation we'll have in a few months about the lessons learned and how we mobilize, right? But the key challenge I have though with their approach is the Muslim thing, right? And I'll explain why. So for me, the next 50 years in this country, the battle is not going to be on the fringes. And what I mean by that is you've got Muslims who represent 5% of the population here, and you've got really right-wing reform voters that represent 15% over here. The battle is going to be for the 80% in the middle, who are quite ambivalent, quite neutral, and really they're there to be convinced. They're there to be convinced that we as Muslim people that live in this country, pay our taxes, we're good, upstanding citizens. We contribute to the society. We bring a lot of good with us, through our prophetic teachings, etc. And I feel like by immediately saying you're the Muslim anything, it becomes quite inclusive. It becomes quite inward-looking, and you're already alienating people before you've even started, right? So I've had loads of people who are non-Muslim contact me about politics, wanting to get involved, and I suspect it'd be tricky if I was called the Muslim whatever.
Yeah.
So my point is that we need to have better PR about us, right? We can absolutely make this an Islamic thing internally, no problem, when we go to the masajids. But I think when we're outward talking to the majority of the people who are not Muslim, we just have to be slightly smarter about how we position ourselves, have better PR. It's like Israel, right? They're the best at this. So you've got Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a clean-shaven, born in I think Florida, and he's always the guy on the camera, right? They don't put Smotrich on, they don't put Ben Gvir on, these sort of radical settlers, because they're extremists in their views. So they're very careful about how they position themselves. And I feel like we should take a leaf out of their book as well.
I just wanted to say, I think that's interesting because our previous guest, Dr. Mamnoon Khan, was basically saying the same thing, that we need to be a bit more critical, a bit more strategic about how we vote.
This is what I was about to say, because Dr. Muhammad Khan he came last week and he said exactly what you're saying. And he was like, look, if we were doing the same things, that kind of view, I don't know if he's part of Palitics. No, I think
I'd like to meet him. He's mentioned him already, but yeah.
But another thing, so are you saying that the Muslim vote should not be called the Muslim vote then? As simple as that?
That was one of the reasons why I didn't decide to continue with them back in November.
So they should just be called the vote?
Can I
something else.
I wonder, like, what your thoughts on this. Do you feel the fact that they called themselves that, do you think it now brought forward some people that were thinking, actually, as Muslims, should we even vote? Does that make sense? Like, that allowed for that kind of conversation?
What, for Muslims to think like that?
There are some Muslims, if you guys remember.
You're right.
Last week, that brother said that as well.
Before we even knew about, I think just after October 7th happened, and we had a discussion about Muslims voting, is that allowed? Because people have this kind of conversation, and because of that organization or whatever being formed, that allowed us to have that kind of conversation and put it out there for community to understand that actually voting isn't haram. For example, something like that. So I wonder what your views on that, because now we've brought forward. There's part of, I'm not saying all Muslims, because we've looked at stats and not every single Muslim did vote. However, I do feel. Is there, because obviously you've looked at data, do you think there was that difference as well? Because now people are having that conversation as Muslims, we're voting, and then you've got that umbrella who's called Muslim vote. Does that then bring more
It did mobilise a lot of Muslims to actually vote for the first time.
That's what I was going to say, because there are some people I know that have never voted. Actually, funny thing is the brother from Luton, who is part of the Muslim vote, he said he never voted his whole life.
Brother Riyaz is saying.
Did we get the wrong message? Because we're talking about voting, and he's like, So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
It's a good point, and I think maybe there's a place for both of us to do different things, right? Perhaps they could sit on the fringes of the kind of Muslim society and try and invest a lot of time in educating Muslims through this process to understand, as you say, that voting is halal, and how to participate in the electoral process. And perhaps politics can be the more non-Muslim facing side of things, where we have allies in other quarters that perhaps wouldn't feel as confident joining a Muslim organization, right? So maybe there's a play for both. But my only challenge to the Muslim vote guys, and I've been very honest with them about this as well, is that we can't just do the same stuff we've always done just with a national banner. And what I mean by that is we need to move away from just I want to restart how we think about politics in this country as Muslims, right? So when somebody says the community have decided this candidate, I want to break those terms. I want to define who are the community, who are the stakeholders, what selection process was run to select a candidate, right? Why did I get notified that there was a process being run? Who, at the end of the process, I want your evaluation, person by person. What were their strengths? What were their weaknesses? How did they vote 9 to 10 or whatever it was? All of this needs to be transparent, because if we do that, we actually awaken the masses' minds, right? We awaken the next generation of young Muslims who can actually play a pivotal role in our politics going forward. But what I'm concerned about is that we're just regurgitating the same stuff we've always ever done, just with a nice glossy website. And for me, that's papering over the cracks of some more fundamental things that need to change.
I like the whole fact that you're using this strategy. Definitely you're bringing in your professional sphere, because you can see. And I think that is the right way to go. So where do you see the next 4, 5 years, 6 years until the next election? What's the aim of politics going forward? What are the short-term goals and the long-term goals?
So we almost want to, there's a lot of things we can do. And it just depends on, I hope after this podcast, people can get in touch with us, join us, volunteer.
You've got a website?
Yeah, we've got a website, we've got social media.
We'll put that, inshallah,
amazing,
on the description.
That'd be very helpful. But we really need volunteers. It's been basically me driving it single-handedly.
So is it currently just in Leicester at the moment? Is that where it's...
It's a national view. Like we give you, you can put in any postcode up and down the country.
But as in the volunteers are...
It's literally just me and a couple of people, that's it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a very small outfit,
Okay, fine.
Because we only launched 3 weeks before the election as well. Because there was a snap election called, we weren't ready, we were hoping it'd be in October. So we had to really push things forward to get it done. And either we either launched it or we waited 5 years. So we thought, let's just go and see what happens.
See what happens, inshallah, learning curve and stuff.
So
volunteers in terms of like what is needed to be done.
So we want to think really strongly about what our strategy is going to be for 5 years. Now, ideally, I would love for politics to become like a YouGov, right? Where we canvass the public opinion sentiments of the pro-Palestinian and or Muslim population, right? So if we had like 50,000 members and then the government thinking about introducing a new law that's going to discriminate boycotting, let's say, for Palestinian territory, we can bang out a survey overnight and we can say 72% of respondents say this, and that becomes quite powerful, data-driven insights.
Twice before,
Exactly. So things like that would be quite useful, and therefore that will then lead us into places where we can write research papers, we can become a bit of a think tank, a pressure group on government policy. So for me, that's how power is played. Like power, with all due respect, like even with these independents, they're not going to yield much power in Parliament. Right? Power is only derived when you shape policy and discourse, and you can only do that when you're in a position of authority. And authority comes typically from having a big following, having data, having research and evaluation done. Right? You can't just be somebody that's saying free Gaza every 5 minutes on Twitter. That's not going to do anything, right?
It's strategic thinking for long-term success, isn't it? That's what it is. And I think I like that view. Because even with the boycotting, we spoke about in one of our podcasts, and Shaykh Noorud-Deen is a big advocate of this as well. And we are as well, that you need to be strategic. And BDS, exactly. And they're strategic, because you could just be...
Otherwise you're boycotting hundreds and
then it's just not, you're not effective.
And I like this, you get lots of people coming.
And that's it. And I think what you're trying to say is making a lot of sense. And I think with the Palestine issue, if you're not strategic, like the Israelis or the Zionists are so strategic in what they do and how they do it.
They're masters at it.
They're masters at it. And I think we just look very like simpletons compared to them when we're, going to protest and that. Alhamdulillah, it's extremely effective.
And I would still advocate.
No, you still need to go, because then you go to where you end up doing nothing actually. But so it's not actually. So I found weirdly, I thought there would be you will have like a try to for the next election have a politics like what's it called, like a candidate. Yeah, that's what I thought.
So my view is very simple, right? I view politics as a game of chess. Right. I would never want to be a candidate myself. But it's about how you move the pieces across the board. That's what power is, right? So for this election, the strategy was, how do you get Labour down to as low as possible?
Yeah.
Right? So they're going to win, but if they win by a short majority,
it gives them...
that means they have less power in real terms,
exactly,
right? Because other parties can coalesce against them. So I think every election will be a different strategy, but for me, power is not by having an independent, I think anyway. Power is about how you shape policy, and for me, it's a multitude of ways. So you need good MPs within the Labour Party to start shaping some of that. You need good MPs outside the Labour Party to start moving it around. You need data being pushed up to start moving some of the policy around, and you need public pressure coming down, so the protests, PDS, all that. So there's like a multifaceted view in terms of the strategy, and they all play their role. But my point is, it needs to be coordinated and orchestrated, because if it's not, you get too much of one thing, and therefore it becomes uneven, and therefore we're not a success. And you talk about the Zionist movement, right? People often forget that the Zionist project is only 150 years old, right? It's a very new concept. And 75 years after their inception, they got their objective, the State of Israel. They delivered it. We're 76 years on from that moment, and we're no closer to liberating Palestine. So that says more about us than it says about them.
Yeah, 100%. No, I think that's a very good view. So last part of it, I want to talk about, in the data, you talk about data. Where's this data coming from? What is this data? Who's doing this? So
the reason why we focused on data was because when we first started looking at the opinion polls back in December, and we were seeing like Labour are going to win every single seat and they're going to win my seat by a landslide, I was like, this just doesn't make sense. Like, I'm speaking to people regularly who are saying they're not going to vote Labour. Like,
where's this coming from?
There's clearly something missing here, right?
Missing,
So what we started, I hired a data scientist and we started pulling together all of these forecasts. And then we started observing. So then we had the council elections that happened in May this year, and the police commissioner. And we had some interesting results in there. So we had Ahmad Yaqub in Birmingham, who got 70,000 votes, which is pretty impressive, actually.
That's quite very impressive.
And there's a few other things, like the Green Party vote was getting more in Muslim areas. People are moving away from Labour in certain ways. And therefore, the conclusion was the higher the Muslim area, the more vote swing was away from Labour.
Okay.
So we were then able to take some of this and build our own model. And we use a technique called, so all the other polls use a technique called MRP, multi-regression polling. We use something called stacked regression polling. So using AI, we got all these opinion polls together and we started working through the best variable for every single metric, right, to optimize the actual prediction. And we then layered in things like the Gaza sentiment, because we knew, so for example, we actually outperformed all the major opinion polls in this election. We had an average error rate of 5 when YouGov was 9 and electoral calculus was 16, for example.
Wow.
So we came really close, right? And more impressively, we scenario modeled 97% of our cases correctly. And what I mean by scenario model, we said, for example, if you vote, so the current forecast is Labour going to win here, but if the Muslims and the pro-Palestine population vote for this guy, they could win. And in 96% of the cases, we were correct in terms of how we predicted it.
So it's predictive analysis on top of...
Yeah.
That's, you see, now that becomes powerful.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Because now if you start applying that in the next election, you can start having conversations with data. We have conversations too often without any proof.
Exactly.
It's just basically SalaamSeeker. But
that's how you maximize your impact as well, when you know it's backed by truth.
And this was my frustration in this election, was the stat I gave you earlier about the Greens independent workers, right? The data was there for them to sit down and say, actually, guys, look, and this is exactly what the French did, right? So the French elections recently, you had 2 rounds of elections. Round 1, Marine Le Pen stormed it. Ultra right-wing, hugely Islamophobic party, right? Now, the other parties bricked it. They were like, what do we do now? And what they actually did, like adults, they sat down and they went through seat by seat in France and said, right, okay, so Macron, your party's better off here, so you go for that, we'll stand down. We're better off here. So they actually worked together tactically. And then round 2, they both came out with more votes, right? And this is exactly the same logic, that if we dropped our egos, and the problem we have is that everybody wants to be the poster boy or poster girl as an independent or whatever it might be. And actually, if your true intention is to help the Palestinians, and you can only help them by moving and shifting power in a certain way, then you've got to remove your ego from the equation, right? But unfortunately, I think we're still very immature as a community.
Especially in politics.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention, because we saw a lot of that. There was, in some places, there were so many independents.
You were like confused. I remember you saying it,
especially on our current Prime Minister as well, because there was a guy who was going to do really well. I think he's a Jewish guy as well. And
Andrew Feinstein in Holborn.
He was going to do so well.
And then the independent came in. I
think there was a conversation about why didn't Green Party
stand down.
And it just made no sense, because he had so much backing.
And if I'm not correct, we spoke to Brother Atiq about this as well. And we spoke to Brother Riyadh about this, saying, why don't you form a coalition or have one person and then try to work together?
And inshallah, I'm hopeful that will come. And I think this election, I don't know about yourself, Rob, but your view on this is that do you feel there's a lot we could learn from, and then inshallah take to the next one to improve, so make sure we don't end up having things like that again, like so many, for example, independent people or whatever. Yeah.
Inshallah, I do hope so. So this is where I mentioned earlier that all of these terms need to go on the table: community, decision made, who are the stakeholders, what was the selection process, right? Because I feel like the reason why we had so many independents was because they felt like they weren't part of any process or discussion, right? Yeah. So if one community is saying, right, this is our guy, we're putting him forward, he's the independent, hang on a minute, you've not consulted the other community members, right? And you know how we are, we're very sectarian. You'll have a Barelvi, Deobandi, you'll have Pakistani, Indian.
Sheikh would love you.
Yeah. Right? This is the reality.
That's all we talk about. We're trying to fight sectarianism.
But it's so true, right? And I feel like we need to move away from this and say, right, okay, so let's pretend all of us live in Luton, this room here, and we want to put one candidate forward. We just make sure that we're representing everyone in our community, right? We get them all in a table, we have a discussion, we agree who the panel is, we agree who the shortlist members are, we agree the process, and that way we actually put on a united front, and therefore when you have funding issues, you come together, you don't have split pots, and this is what I mean by move away from traditional community politics and think wider and more strategically.
MashaAllah, I think
so.
It makes sense.
What for us people? It's lost. So for us people who we've been exposed to the Muslim vote and only now knowing about politics, what action do we now need to take for us to make sure that the next election we have the maximum impact and we make sure politics does what it achieves, what it wants to achieve? Yeah,
so we want to currently over the next 6 months pull together a really robust political strategy that outlines what the roadmap is over the next 5 to 50 years, right? Because it is a long journey, right? We're not going to, even in 5 years time, inshallah there's some gain, but this is a really long-term strategy. So the key thing I would say to people is what politics will try and do is empower you to understand how the political mechanics work. Because again, going back to the independent argument, that doesn't yield any power, right? You need to understand how does power work. So power works in this country by understanding that you need to shape policy, be part of APPGs, select committees, etc. And that's what actually has an impact. So today we saw the restoring of funding for UNRWA, which is a UN relief agency for the Palestinians, right? And that wasn't done by independents. That was done because there was some pressure within the Labour Party. So we have all these levers that I mentioned earlier of how you put pressure on, and we need to work out how do we create those levers and obviously optimize them when we need to.
MashaAllah, honestly, I feel like we need to get you back again, bro. Talk more. I mean, it'd be nice to get you back again, 6 months down the line, see where politics are.
Inshallah.
And I think you should stay in touch with myself and Brother Faiaz, because we're both quite into data and look at that.
You can volunteer. We need people, right?
So inshallah, we'll definitely converse because we are interested in it. But thank you so much for coming. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure the viewers have a new thought on politics. We'll put the link down as well, inshallah. And if you've got a contact detail as well for anyone that's interested in volunteering, give that to us as well. We'll put it down, inshallah. But thank you so much for coming, and inshallah, please continue to support us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.